Right, right. Totally agree.
Well, for me,
very much, Richard.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died.
He died.
I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima.
I'm sure he did.
And you know, is the price worth it?
He died.
I think this is a very hard choice, but the price, we think the price is worth it. The price is worth it.
Evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter, don't frankly matter, don't frankly matter.
well, my background doesn't really provide any indication of what motivated me to start writing about the things I started writing about. So I don't know if that's, you know, it's not like I went to some Ivy League school and was inspired to serve humanity through their teachings and then realized the system was horribly corrupt and then decided to fight against it. Pretty much a normal background. So what inspired me was, well, I guess this ties in, was when I finally I was able to start my own business and was making a decent amount of money, so I all of a sudden had some free time here and was able to start looking into things. And as I was looking into things, I started to realize that much of what was taught wasn't true, and that just basically snowballed. It started with an initial discovery, watching politicians on a particular issue manipulate the public, and that was with regard to online gambling. This was before the powers that be, the same powers that allow gambling in churches and allow gambling in every state practically, and allow gambling in the casinos and all this other stuff, were trying to pass legislation that protected the vested interests that were already profiting from gambling, and of course was using the protect the public lie to do it. And the hypocrisy of it was so over the top, and the deception that they were using was so ridiculous. You know, they were basically claiming that little Billy could get a hold of your credit card and gamble away your house and you're going to lose everything, which was totally untrue, obviously. I mean, if somebody uses your credit card against your will, the maximum liability is $50. There was no way that the people who were saying this actually believed it was true. It was impossible that they believed it. So I knew they were lying, and I knew they were using this scare tactic to try to terrify the public into accepting this anti-gaming legislation that nobody wanted. Nobody asked for it except for the people who they were representing. The politicians, of course, were being put forward to do this by people who, of course, make money from gambling and saw this as competition. And isn't that what government is, really? Unfortunately, at this point, it's just a way to protect monopoly and wield power. So that's really what started it all, was because I saw this happening. I couldn't believe it, and I began writing articles. This was the first time where I really started writing things that were politically oriented, like regardless of where you feel on the issue of gambling. If somebody wants to sit in their house and play nickel slots, they should be permitted to do so. It's their money. I mean, that's the bottom line. Is this is not a place where the government should intrude, and nobody is, especially when that same person can legally go mortgage their house in a casino and blow all their money there. Do you understand what I mean?
Right.
So
totally agree.
Right. So that's what started the whole the political aspect of me writing.
And so I think this is an important and interesting topic in a way, because one of the things I think I'm noticing in our society as a whole nowadays is that there's an awakening, going across America and the world. And I've taken note of, like Alex Jones, he made a comment once that his awakening started after he read None Dare Call It Conspiracy. And
Yeah.
for him, that's still the most important book. That's really opened his eyes. And then Glenn Beck, and I share this with Glenn. I'm not a Glenn Beck fan, by the way, but Glenn Beck said that his awakening was when they failed to control the borders, or even find out he was entering or leaving the borders of the United States. To him, that was evidence that there really was not a war on terror. Okay. And so then if you look at Sibel Edmonds, for example, we're kind of familiar with her and some of the great work she's done. She was a starry-eyed believer in the American dream, and then she went to work for the FBI and found out that things were not really as they seemed. And this had to do specifically with things around 9/11, right?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of people like that, David, like Sibel, who are very moral people of high integrity that go into these agencies, but the vast majority of them are so compartmentalized, and it's such a hierarchical structure that they're just told what to do, obviously, and then they focus on the things that they focus on, and they end up serving this system that inevitably undermines things that they truly believe in. Sibel, in her case, obviously, was in the unique position of doing translations. She was so sought after because there were so few who could actually translate the communications that she actually heard what was going on between these corrupt individuals within our government and other governments. So there's no compartmentalizing that. And she did what any person of high integrity would do. She blew the whistle on it.
And she paid the price severely.
Of course. Yeah.
Right. And then, we look at other people like James Corbett of the Corbett Report. His awakening occurred via, I guess, Alex Jones in the 9/11 situation, because he reports that he believed everything about the official report on 9/11 until he started looking into it. And, the physics and the facts just do not match, what they had reported. I think 9/11 is kind of an event that caused a lot of changes, that some of which are unintended. But I think that caused me to be very interested in paying attention to what's really going on here, because, I think it's obvious to any thinking person that the 9/11 official report is nothing more than a whitewash, and I don't know if you agree with that or not. But
I've written plenty about 9/11, believe absolutely it was a multiple intelligence agencies, multiple state-sponsored event. The official account is ridiculous. And for people to hear that for the first time, again, if they're indoctrinated in our school systems, it would seem absurd. But then, I'll tell you want to talk about awakening. Again, I cover this in the book. One of the things that really jarred me was when I first came across the Northwoods document. Because up to that point, the idea that our government would actually create terrorists so that they could attack U.S. targets, so they could then use those attacks to justify a foreign policy that they had already established, would have sounded absolutely, completely ridiculous to me. But then there you go. Go to Georgetown University, or not Georgetown, I'm sorry, George Washington, National Security Archives, and you can download the Northwoods document. And there it is, right there. And it isn't a long document, doesn't take very long to read it, and you will hear, point by point, all of the ways that they intended to manipulate the U.S. population into supporting something that they wanted that was completely illegitimate, that they had, especially if you believe in the concept of the electorate determining what the government should and shouldn't do.
And the thing that amazes me is how much of this is out in the wide open. Just by, as a lot of people term open source investigation, you can get on WikiLeaks and other places and do a lot of research, whether it's Operation Paperclip or the Gladio operation, the Left Behind, that started in 1948. All of this stuff.
Before that, believe it or not, they prior to the end of World, they had a predecessor. It wasn't actually called Gladio yet, but yeah, they were working on that before the end of World War II. So it's it's there, but it's not. you know, unfortunately, everybody, the vast majority of people, don't seek out information on their own. This is the beauty of the internet. With the TV and with the radio, it's a one-way communication. So if you assume 95% of the population gets their news from this one-way communication, you just sit in front of the television and the television tells you stuff. And that's it. There's no way to challenge it. There's no way to question it. It's just this is what the facts are. So that's what gets into their brain. And that 95% then goes out into the world under the assumption that that's the most important thing to be talking about and that the facts have been presented accurately. So then they talk about it amongst themselves at the water cooler and everywhere else. And that just becomes the reality. That becomes the reality
Right.
because it's all anybody knows. Whereas the information that undermines that false reality has to be sought. You have to actually go out. The schools aren't going to teach you about what the government did in Operation Gladio, about the terrorists and murderers that were put on the payroll in Operation Paperclip, for instance. They're not going to tell you about. They're not going to tell you about injecting women with radioactive elements and telling them that it was a vitamin cocktail.
Right.
Injecting women with radioactive elements and telling them that it was a vitamin cocktail
Right.
to help their babies
And
be
there was-
healthy. You know, in prestigious hospitals, some
Right.
pregnant woman comes in and the nice doctor in a white coat says, okay, well, we're going to give you a vitamin cocktail here to make your baby healthy. And it's really, you know, I believe, I don't remember if I believe it was plutonium they injected them with. So that's nice.
Yeah, there's several different isotopes that they injected them with, and just to test cancer. So they induced cancer into innocent men, women, and children,
Yeah, they
and
fed.
used Americans as guinea pigs.
And you can imagine these are the things that are proven. Okay, you can
Right.
imagine how many things have not been uncovered. You can just imagine it because obviously they do everything they can to bury this stuff. Start looking into eugenics if you want a whole other horror story. That's part of the bonus material for Tragedy and Hope 101 is I've condensed Eugenics, a Reassessment by Richard Lynn, who is a proponent of eugenics and believes that, unfortunately, although we know the United States government forcibly sterilized 60,000 people, he believes it should have been 60 million. So
Right.
that'll give you an idea. And at the time, when they were doing the sterilizations, that would have equaled an enormous percentage of the U.S. population. So that's just a whole other issue. And then I also have War Against the Weak, which is the counterpoint, which is an excellent book. So these are condensed versions of those books. Anybody who's interested in eugenics can get the basic gist of what a horror all that was. And then I would, of course, encourage them to actually buy the full books. They might not want to buy Eugenics, a Reassessment because it's a textbook. It's like $140. Most people won't pay that.
Right.
But the War Against the Weak is an excellent book.
Right. I've checked into those, and I've not read it, but I saw a video of Professor Lynn or Dr. Lynn giving a speech on the internet, and it was kind of interesting. He's pretty aged, but the people in the audience were obviously, you know, just worshipped him as a, you know, an earthly god. Like everything that came out of his mouth was true. So it's kind of frightening when you consider that. So let's go ahead and go through some of your books a little bit and talk about those. And what I'd like to do is kind of get a timeline and to underscore, you know, why I think it is that your books are so very important. You know, we have a lot of people writing on a lot of topics. You know, we've had a lot of people go over the Federal Reserve and, you know, the banking cartel, etc. And so the question is, you know, why are Joe Plummer's books so important? And of course, my answer, and we've talked about this before, is that the average person doesn't have time to do the deep level research to read these 1,300-page books like Tragedy and Hope. And what you have a unique talent in doing, I believe, is you go through and you do all the hard, heavy lifting. You read, do the research, and you're able to put all this together in a very organized manner in a much shorter book that could be 175, 200 pages that the average person could, have access to. And so that's one of the reasons I think your books are so important. And not just that, but the topics that you've chosen to write about. So if we could, I'd like to just kind of go through the timeline quickly on some of the books here and just talk about your career in writing. And the first thing I noticed is one of your first books was on stopping drinking without using the AA methodology. So I don't know if you wanted to touch on that just a minute to give us some insight into that.
Well, yeah, that's something I felt, I guess you could use that as proof that I've always had a real problem with information that's widely accepted that is untrue, or that at least I believe is untrue. So, I was forced into this rehabilitation 12-step thing when I was like 12 years old. I started using drugs and drinking at a very young age, obviously. And I'll just never forget, even at that young age, the impact of having this seemingly just this ubiquitous idea of what I was doing was a symptom of a disease, and that I was powerless over this disease, and that for the rest of my life I was going to be a victim of this disease, and the only way I could possibly save myself was to go do these 12 steps and turn my life over to God and all these other things. And I remember thinking to myself at the time how just totally ridiculous all of this sounded, but at the same time being struck by the arrogance and condescending tone of those who defended it when I would say, yeah, but this is ridiculous, or whatever, and they'd say, oh, well, you're just in denial. That's proof that you're in denial, and oh yeah, you're going to fix yourself, and nobody else can, all these other things. And the basic thing boiled down to it, for me, this was what it boiled down to. You're not going to convince me that I am powerless over something that I am physically choosing to do. Now, I understand that it might be emotionally satisfying for some people to, if they're in a predicament and they're engaged in self-destructive behavior, to be told that, well, you know what, it's not your fault, it's a disease, it's out of your control and all this other stuff. But that wasn't something that I could accept, because in my view, I knew what was going on in my mind. I knew how I was representing drinking to myself, how I was representing doing drugs to myself, and I knew that that played the most important role in why I was drinking and doing drugs. Even later, like let's say when I might have decided, okay, I'd like to cut back on this. If I decide, oh, tonight I'm going to go out and I'm going to party, I knew that was directly tied to the associations in my mind of what going out and partying meant. Now, I eventually quit doing all that stuff. I haven't drank since I was 21. I'm 45 now, so that's a long time. I've been sober longer than I was alive when I was doing that stuff. But
well, that makes sense to me. And if you think about people that have quit smoking, for example, and these are all anecdotal examples, but if you think about, people like I've heard of, they just decided one day to quit smoking. They got fed up with it, and they just made a decision, and that's taking power. Not all of us can do that.
It depends on. Okay, so this is what for anybody who wants to read my thoughts on this, it's short, and it's free. Like everything that I have written, all of my books are available for free online if people don't want to buy them. Same thing with the Stop Drinking. It's basically how to stop anything. It isn't just about drinking. It's about how the associations that you form in your mind ultimately determine your behavior, and how to correct associations that, if you look at them more closely, are clearly not right. So with regard to drinking, when drinking became literally the enemy of everything that I ever hoped to achieve in life based on the way it was affecting me and affecting my behavior, it became very easy for me to abstain from drinking. Once that became, instead of it's a way to have fun and it's a way to bond with people and it's a way to do, you know, all these things that society would imply is the truth about drinking, when it became, it is literally a poison. It poisons me spiritually. It undermines my capacity to achieve my best. It is the enemy of everything that I ever hoped to achieve in my life, because I can't make any progress if I'm doing well and then all of a sudden I go out and I get drunk and I get a DUI and now I'm going to jail. This isn't going to actually help me achieve the things that I ultimately want to achieve in life. It isn't worth it. The cost versus the reward is so out of balance that there is no reward at all. So once people,
Right.
obviously there's more depth to it than this. It'd be hard for me to
Right.
summarize it in a paragraph. But the concept is of actually going through and looking through your mind and analyzing what is drawing you to a particular behavior, especially if you know it's counterproductive. And without fail, I promise everybody, whenever they're feeling compelled to do something, they will notice, well, of course, because I'm representing it to myself in a positive way. For whatever reason, my mind at this point has ignored those circuits that prevent or that provide a more honest representation of what all this stuff is, and it's instead focused on these circuits that present this false representation of fun and all these things that if I just slow down a little bit, I can reroute my mind back to those other circuits, start to build those up, make those more strong, and let these false ones die out. And this is, an example of neuroplasticity as far as I'm concerned, because once you've done this enough, it is effortless. It becomes
Wow.
effortless
Yeah.
because it truly is your honest representation. If you said, hey, Joe, you want to do a couple shots of whiskey? My honest, effortless response is the same as if you said, hey, Joe, you want to do a couple shots of diarrhea? Here you go. I mean, I'm serious. It's literally that. I don't have to struggle to say, no, thanks. I get that you
Right.
like it. I get that you appear to be having fun doing it, but I don't want it. Thank
Right.
you. It's just
Right.
that it really does work that way.
That's pretty amazing.
Well, it's and hopefully, and people have written me and thanked me for posting it. But that would be an example of, even before I was politically aware or writing politically, that I couldn't accept what was just commonly accepted if I truly believed it wasn't true. It doesn't mean I challenge absolutely everything that's commonly accepted. I believe in gravity, and, I don't have any reason to believe that the Earth revolves around the sun. I don't have any reason to, doubt those things, but other things, yes. If there's a problem, then I have to challenge it.
I like your terminology, about, the circuits and the plasticity, etc. My initial thought is it's kind of a form of self-hypnosis where you're really kind of convincing yourself to a lie, and if you back off and realize the truth, then it'd be easy to, like you said, slow down and realize that it's not helping you and it's not fun at all. Right. So I think that is really, really, absolutely amazing.
Well, I appreciate it, and when people write and say it was very helpful to them, nothing makes me feel
Right.
better than that.
So let's go forward now. That was around 1998, and if we go forward a few years, we hit 2004, according to my timeline, and you produced a set of recordings, audio recordings, that I've had the pleasure of listening to, and I'm going to listen to them probably once a week or once a month or something, because I found them so helpful just with myself. But you provide some really, really good ideas, and I can't help, of course, I didn't look at the Stop Drinking Kindle that you produced, but it sounds a little bit like, the successful thinking has its roots in some of the Stop Drinking material, as far as I can tell. But I think the ideas that you have about being thankful and appreciative for what you have, and the ideas of contribution, to always contribute, and the ideas of providing value, and also to me is kind of the vision. You talk about having a vision, and so I think there's a lot of really good data in there that if people take a look at that, I think they can benefit from.
All right, so for me, this was it was a attempt to summarize the things that I felt had been most useful to me up until that point in my life. So obviously, like I said, I first started getting high when I was 9 years old, and I was already in quite a bit of trouble early on. So I had to dig myself out of all that stuff. And I think that the 1 Hour Guide to Successful Thinking was really just my way of summarizing the tools that were useful to me, that were not useful. They were invaluable. They were necessary. These are the things that helped me dig my way out of all that stuff. So yeah, again, anybody who can, I'll tell you something, what actually inspired me to do that, just like Dishonest Money, reading Ed Griffin's The Creature from Jekyll Island, I was just like, oh my God, this information is so powerful, it's so important, more people need to read this. I kind of felt the same way about Earl Nightingale's Lead the Field. So anybody who's interested in a more in-depth account of this stuff that I cover in the 1 Hour Guide to Successful Thinking, I would recommend Earl Nightingale's Lead the Field, because it's fantastic. That pretty much was really it gave me the idea of, you know what, this is useful. Putting these kind of things down on tape and making it easily accessible to people is really useful. And of course, as usual, it was I think Lead the Field is 6 CDs. Mine is 1. The Creature from Jekyll Island is 600 pages, which unfortunately I was unable to get a lot of people to read it. So I wrote something that covers what I feel is the most important elements of the story in less, so we can get the information to more people, and then hopefully they will go on and then go through the more expanded information that's available.
So let's go forward now, and if we go to 2008, you wrote Dishonest Money. I've read 3 of your books. This is the last one that I read. I was a little bit hesitant to read it because I consider myself somewhat of an expert on money, because I've read a lot about it, and I've been involved in that professionally quite a bit. And so I was pleasantly surprised that I actually learned quite a bit in your book. And I think it's critical for most people to get a hold of this book and understand what's in there. And again, I could be off base here, but I see it as another way that you're contributing to the general conversation, of the working person and other people that just don't have time, by providing these great insights in these. This is a 175-page book, so I see it as coming out of The Creature from Jekyll Island. A lot of it is referenced in there, which is a huge book. So I don't know if you can talk a little bit about Dishonest Money or not, and how much was distilled from G. Edward Griffin, and then how much is yours, or what other sources did you grab onto to produce this?
Well, there are a lot of sources, but what I always try to do is I try to pick the one that I feel is the best single source. In case you haven't figured it out by now, I'm really into editing and condensing things down to the most important elements, because I just think that's what we should do. People don't have a lot of time, and nothing should be more complicated than it needs to be. And unfortunately, it's very easy to make things difficult, and it's very difficult to make things easy. So
Right.
I do the best I can to make things as easy as possible. So for me, I'd read all sorts of books on economics, but as far as I was concerned, if I was going to direct anybody to one specific book, So for instance, Money, Bank, Credit, and Economic Cycles by Jesus Huerta de Soto is an excellent book, surprisingly excellent, considering it really is a textbook. And I believe it was originally written in German, and it's 800 pages.
Of course.
Yeah, but it's really, I found it quite good, but I also know that most people won't. So, it's like not everybody is interested in digging into these things at that level, or they might not be comfortable with the academic tone, the presentation. All of these other things I think really affect people in a negative way, the average person. And it's not to be derogatory, it's just a matter of taste. And it isn't that they couldn't make themselves if they wanted to, it's just that they don't see any reason to make themselves because they don't want to. So,
right.
With Dishonest Money, which was it's interesting, that's the last book you read. It was the first book that I wrote. It covers our monetary system, and as far as I was concerned, I wanted to direct people towards The Creature from Jekyll Island, because that was my goal originally. I was buying copies of The Creature from Jekyll Island and giving it to people, and I couldn't get them to read it. I think because they were intimidated by it. They're intimidated by the topic because it's new to them, and people have a tendency to be leery of things that they don't understand. For whatever reason, it makes them anxious to go into things that they're not familiar with. And then on top of that, it's a 600-page book, which is just that much more intimidating. So I eventually decided, well, maybe if we do this stepping stone to this, because this is imperative that people understand the power, this exclusive right that the bankers have given themselves to simply create money out of thin air. It is imperative for people to understand that power. How about we bust it down and make it, and take, there are other sources, but we're going to break it down into its simplest parts, and then if people want more information, let's send them to just this one book. If you're just going to read one book on this topic that is really very thoroughly done, let's send them to The Creature from Jekyll Island, because I think that's just about as good as you're going to get.
Right. And, along that line of thought can you imagine, I've thought about this after reading Dishonest Money, can you imagine how much better the world would be, or America would be, if this book were taught in all of our public school systems and universities? If people knew what was in this book, I just think we'd be a lot better off in terms of politics, geopolitics, economics, and in every way.
Of course, because the government wouldn't be anything near what it is, because the mechanism for creating what the government is today wouldn't exist.
To me, instead of getting this book, which is, contains truth, we're getting falsehood. And that's part of their control over, the general population, is to produce a false narrative and having everybody believe in it. And so you have the groupthink, whereas if you don't believe, the official line of thought, then you wear a tinfoil hat or whatever.
Whatever pejorative they can come up with.
So that's Dishonest Money. Let's go to the next book. And again, I was a little reluctant about reading this one. The first book I read of yours was Tragedy and Hope 101, which really, made me a fan of yours quite a bit. And so this was my second book I read of yours. And again, I typically do not read novels. I read Sybil Edmonds' Lone Gladio, which is a novel. But I'm not really into fiction. I'd rather get something I can use today that will benefit me in terms of knowledge and understanding. So I'm kind of a nerd that way. So to me, reading a fiction is a little bit waste of time. But I must admit, after reading this, and I've told you this, before, that I can't quit thinking about this book, because it brings up so many deep-seated assumptions. And the debate that goes on between the two major characters in this book is absolutely brilliant in my mind. And I know you must have spent a lot of time thinking about this debate. but you've done a great job proving up, the other side of the story in terms of the elite. What makes them powerful, what makes their position so logical and so realistic. And so you've done a great job proving up the side, in my mind, for the elite and how they control the money and the people of the world. So I wasn't so convinced about the other side. So I don't know if you have any comments on this, but I saw, Howard as, being the proponent for the elite, and then Alex was, the proponent for individual freedom and justice and rights. And so, in your mind, who actually won the debate? Because I thought you did a really good job for Howard.
I understand, and it was very, very difficult for me to write that book for that very reason. And when I say very difficult, I mean it was emotionally difficult for me, because I realized that from the perspective of a debate, there was no two ways about it that Howard was winning the debate. Howard was winning the logical argument because there are no emotional considerations. But the goal of the book was to present the mindset of the elite. I wanted people to understand it. I certainly don't want people to think that I'm advocating it. But at the very least, I want them to understand how they view the world and how a very intelligent human being can be lured in to this mindset, especially when they see how easily manipulated everybody else is. And they see the distance between their understanding and their position and these others that really, in their view, are just the inferior class. So as far as that was my primary objective, was to very clearly present the mindset in such a way that people could see it. And the only way I could do that would be to create arguments that would make them say, well, yeah, that makes sense. So now what's the problem that we have? The problem we have then is, okay, well, are we going to convert people over to this idea that that's just the way it should be? I would certainly hope not, because what it really boils down to is this is a scientific approach. It's like the scientific outlook, Bertrand Russell, to managing society. And a scientific approach to managing the world without moral considerations and without integrity will lead to a hell on earth. So this is the further math that people can do. It will only lead to the ability to create more deadly bombs, more effective means of torture, more effective means of dominating and controlling people. So hopefully what people can take from this is the idea that even though it might be a compelling idea from a practical standpoint about power and exercising power, the end result is, even if this became widely adopted, it would inevitably self-destruct in the struggle for power amongst those who were most powerful. So in the end, this system can do nothing but commit suicide. And it doesn't take a whole lot of effort to do that math, and see, inevitably, it might originally and initially appear effective and useful, but in the end, it will just become this atrocious system of one group imposing its will through power on another who is using the same system and the same ideology, no moral considerations, against one another, and nothing remains. Now, if you want to get into the elements that are more common among people, which would be just what does it mean to be a human being? What does it mean? What is beautiful about life? What is beautiful about being human? Then the arguments in favor of that against this scientific approach are endless.
Right.
But ultimately, hopefully I summarized it reasonably well, that I agree that Howard was very convincing, but at the same time, we play that argument out, and where do we end? And I haven't written part 2 yet, so
Right.
we'll see where we get with part 2 when I decide to pick that up.
Right, and you know, one of the things that I loved about it was the different chapters would reference different books that are considered major books in certain areas. For example, a book on propaganda by Edward Bernays. And for those that are not familiar with Edward Bernays, there's lots of really great videos on YouTube. He is, I think, a cousin of Freud, and also he was the one that convinced women that it was okay for women to smoke. I mean, the cigarette companies went to him and said, "Well,
Liberty torches.
yeah, so what are we going to do to get the women to start smoking?" And so everybody's used Edward Bernays' propaganda. In fact, I think Hitler used some of those techniques. And so these are, fundamental and profoundly important books and concepts that I think the average person needs to be aware of. And so that was on the chapter on propaganda, right? And
You notice that I snuck that in there. That's what I
Yeah.
did. I figured, all right, I'm going to write a novel because I'm trying to reach out past the choir, but this is a way for me to try to sneak these nonfiction topics and books into the story. If I can do that, maybe it will. And you'll notice, like, something like propaganda is so short that even people who don't like to read nonfiction can get through it in no time. And yeah, Edward Bernays helped sell World War I. He helped sell the invasion of Guatemala and the overthrow of its government in 1954. So the Liberty Torches, on and on and on. He was instrumental in manipulating public perception and believed that it was a vital part of what it meant to be a democracy.
right, and then we have, like you mentioned earlier, we have the Scientific Outlook by Bertrand Russell. And I believe the front page of your book, the preface, you have a quote from Bertrand Russell, which I will read here in just a minute. So you have the Scientific Outlook by Bertrand Russell involved. You have eugenics, a reassessment, which you mentioned just previously. I did try to get a copy of that, and as you mentioned, it's the cheapest price I found was $125 or something, and I just decided not to get it because I may not read it.
You can read the condensed version in the bonus material online. I think that would be a very useful place for you to start, because you're going to get, you'll get the main arguments that at least I think are most telling and offensive. And so, and then also I have whenever I'm reading a book, I highlight and note a lot of different things, but then I'll also, if I come across something that's particularly disturbing to me, I have to stop at that moment and immediately write my argument against it. So if you go to this condensed version, you'll not only find a lot of the things that I highlighted in the text, you'll find my immediate arguments, or at least my thoughts on that particular text immediately below it. So you might find it interesting.
Yeah, I'll do that. I'll do that. That will help me out a lot because, I don't want to spend $150 for a book and not read it. But
Don't blame you.
Um, and I did take the time to go, look into some eugenics YouTube videos, and of course, if we look at some of our leadership today, like Bill Gates and some of the foundations, Bill Gates' father was a eugenicist, and likewise Bill is, as far as I can tell. And so these are important concepts, even though they're interwoven within a novel. I think they're critically important to us on a day-to-day basis to understand where these people come from.
Okay, the trilogy basically boils down to this so far. Dishonest money was meant to cover the inherently corrupt nature of our economic system. Tragedy and Hope 101 delves more into the political system itself, and then Leaving the Illusion was meant to present the mindset of those who run the economic and the political system. So that was my attempt, really, to just create that synergistic effect. And obviously, whether or not somebody reads all three or not, I don't know, but those were the three primary bases that I wanted to cover. And now the only thing that's really imperative to me that I feel very compelled to tackle would be a book on solutions. So that would be the next thing that I think needs to be done.
Okay, so we can talk about solutions here in a minute. I'd like to talk a little bit about Diplomacy by Henry Kissinger, just a tad, and Century of War, this sort of thing. But back when I was in high school, a good friend of mine was John Bircher, and basically I poo-pooed everything he said. Of course, the John Birchers hated Henry Kissinger. They talked about the CFR, the Trilateral Commission, and all this sort of thing. And so since my high school days, I've realized that a lot of what these guys were saying is absolutely true. And of course, I thought in Leaving the Illusion, Howard's position on Henry Kissinger, I think, was that Henry was like an example of a true elite that was able to really tell the truth at all times without regard to human frailty or morals or any of these other things that kind of slow these guys down. So what are your thoughts on Henry Kissinger in that regard?
Henry Kissinger is exactly what is required to be at the apex of this type of system. So absolutely, yeah, Howard's account and his praise for Henry Kissinger revolved around the fact that he is, like E.H. Carr, somebody who believes in the practical scientific approach to things. And it's easy to respond emotionally to that, which, as you said, your friend, he was the boogeyman and they would thrash him, I imagine, and what a scumbag he is and all this other stuff. But I found that all to be really draining. He just is what he is. Whether he's a sociopath, and there's some sociopathic tendencies that enables a person to be that, whether it's developed over time, cultivated, I have no idea. But the truth of the matter is that there are people who function this way. They believe these things, and that makes them ideally suited for the roles in which they find themselves. Power attracts those who are least fit to possess it. So if you're interested in really understanding what's possible, I think it's very important to understand the mindset of the people who implement these types of policies, the people who sit around and speak about the masses as if they were just vermin to be controlled, no different than they would think of insects and insect infestation in the house. This is just what it is.
Right.
You are not part of their group. You're not. Literally, you're
Right.
not. It's not just, oh, okay, they have more money and more power. They think differently. They think differently. And
Right.
unfortunately for me, I can see how they think. I understand it. And it's just not good.
and you proved up their side of the argument very well, I thought, in this book. So that indicates you do truly understand their viewpoint in my mind.
You read enough of their stuff. If you read enough of their works, it becomes very apparent how they think.
Right.
And then one of your, I guess I would call this one of your saving graces here would be, William Engdahl.
Yeah.
And so, you were hoping he would save your bacon in the debate. And so that's kind of a counter argument to all these other books that are referenced in this novel.
I wanted to bring him up because I think he's a very good author. He's obviously dedicated to this, and he's an Ivy League educated man as well. And Quigley was Ivy League educated, but Engdahl is as well, but clearly has gone in the other direction, dedicating his life to what Howard would call a pursuit of wasteful endeavor. But for him, clearly it isn't. He's trying to go out there and help people understand how the world actually operates at the highest levels and within the Ivy League halls.
To say that this was the first book I read of yours, and I cannot tell you how wonderful I thought this book was, and how impressed I was that you had taken the time. I don't recall how much time it took you, but let's say 6,000 hours or something that comes to mind of research. And so when I look at some of the books, like Tragedy and Hope, or even Viktor Frankl's book, which I read in high school, called Man's Search for Meaning. I don't know if you read that book or not, but it's a very powerful book. And basically, he was in Auschwitz in a prison camp, and he talks about what made him survive. He was one of the very few survivors, and so the reason I'm comparing your book to his is the fact that what a great deal it was. For the price of a paperback by Viktor Frankl, I could go and live his life experience and benefit from all of his life experience for the price of a paperback. And so,
I said, amen.
That's
one of the things. It's one of the things about books that I think people don't recognize is the value that you can take from a well-written book, something like that. I mean, it's ridiculous. You get his entire life experience and something that can provide so much insight that is unavailable. How many people lived through Auschwitz and can share with you the ultimate considerations that, what is the meaning of life? The meaning of life is to live a meaningful life, something like that. To come across something that's that powerful can be, for the price of a paperback, like you said, is I don't know how you can pass up on something like that.
Exactly. And so here we're looking at Tragedy and Hope, and of course, I'll have a few shots of this book, for the viewing folks here. But, it's 1,316 pages, some odd, the original Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. And, of course, as we've discussed, he's an academician. He's very finely tuned, very intelligent, very well read. He spent 20 years, as we talked about, looking into this topic. He also had 2 years of unlimited access to the CFR's archives, and was tangentially, could be considered somewhat of an insider, even though he wasn't on the inside ring, probably, of the control structure. But, this is an incredible opportunity for people to take a look at, who really runs the world, and not just who runs it, but how do they do it? How do they accomplish this?
That's the most important part. The most important.
So 203 pages, you can read that in a few nights, even if you have a busy job, where you're very busy with your family, but a few weekends you ought to be able to hammer that out. But I think this is a great bargain. You get to read 1,300 pages of academic work into a much more digestible, better organized, updated version of Tragedy and Hope. So I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that.
I appreciate your thoughts on it. I'm always very, very grateful when people write me or people like yourself tell me that you found the information useful, because obviously That's the end goal, is to present the information in a way that anybody who's interested in it can take value from it. So if I accomplish that, then I can't ask for really anything in addition to that is just a bonus. So with regard to this book, obviously I want people to read it. So like I said before, all of my stuff is available online for free. Of course, I would prefer that you buy it because that's how I'd be compensated. But if it comes right down to it, what I want the most is for somebody to read it. So yeah, I mean, if I were going to add anything, that's it. I appreciate very much your thoughts on the book, and I've received other people have written me, and people are buying cases of it because they want to give it out to people. I mean, you can imagine how that feels. Feels good.
And like, your dishonest money, what amazes me, you're going to be writing a book on, and we're going to talk about that here in a minute, but on solutions. But I can see a very clear solution right now, and that is if our people in the public school system, the teachers, the educators, and the students, if they knew what was contained in tragedy and hope and in dishonest money, this would be a much improved country and a much improved world in my mind.
They don't take control of the education system for no reason. They don't take control of the media for no reason. There's a reason why they control these information dissemination centers. Those are the opinion-forming agencies. And there's a reason why they like to control those things. So ultimately, it would be fantastic, but it's very unlikely that people who profit from the current system are going to allow things into that system that would ultimately undermine and overturn that system. So as far as solutions are concerned, I do cover a few things briefly in Tragedy and Hope 101 that function within the current system. So for instance, jury nullification at the state level. I briefly touch on getting your money out because I explain how, regardless of whether or not they own the money that's in the system that you're providing in their accounts, in the banks, in the trust funds, in the insurance companies, all this other stuff, regardless of whether or not they own it, they get to direct it. So that's an element of power that they enjoy. Clearly, the Federal Reserve System, the ability to create money out of thin air, is powerful beyond any ability to explain with words. So I touch on some of those things, but in the next book, what I really want to do is I want to talk about building a parallel system, because I believe, I don't know, I think it might have been Aristotle, somebody a long time ago figured out, and I believe it's true, that the best way to destroy the old is to build a better new. So if we can start establishing a parallel system that competes with the current system monetarily, a parallel system that in production, so things like 3D printing. We can already see a parallel system in information dissemination through the internet, which has been absolutely devastating to them. Devastating. Their information monopoly has been almost already.
Well, even Hillary Clinton said that they're losing the info world war.
Yes.
We are in an information war, and we are losing that war. I'll be very blunt in my assessment.
So these, in my view, and in education, which again, you take the internet, would be a perfect example of a way to bypass the current monopoly. I think that's where we need to move. I think that's ideally what's going to do it. That and awareness. So we need both. We need people to become progressively more aware, but ultimately the people who build these competing systems, if they're built properly, they will attract support organically, and that will, the benefits will just organically draw people, whether they're politically motivated or not. And I think ultimately that's what's going to help us.
Right, I agree. And, I think education is, as they say, fundamental, because if people knew what was contained in these two books that we're talking about, or all three of them, the elite and the manipulators, the controllers, and the people that shouldn't be in power, they would have a very difficult time. And it would awaken the population, and I don't think they would be able to be fooled so easily by, you know, the corporate media, you know, that really kind of echoes the government's position on just about everything and protects their own vested interest.
I agree.
And of course,
I agree.
you know, they're owned by what, 6 major corporations on 95% of the media. So of course it makes sense, right?
I think that it's happening. So we're already witnessing that awakening. It's happening right now. So yeah, ideally they can, you know, if people find this information useful, I ask, if you find it useful, you think it's compelling, you think it's presented in a way that is easy to understand and isn't too long and drawn out and all that, then just the best way to help is to share it with other people, because people appreciate that. I mean, I know I appreciate it when somebody recommends a book and I read it and I find it useful and it's fantastic. I might not have heard about that, you know, that particular book or whatever. So to the extent that people read the information and find it useful, the best way to accelerate this ongoing awakening is to just tell other people, check this out. Hey, you can check it out online. It doesn't cost anything. It's really good. And if you want to check the sources, there's plenty of So for instance, Tragedy and Hope 101, I think, you know, 300 different footnotes in a 200-page book. Let's say, for instance, that somebody wants to have Tragedy and Hope, but they don't necessarily want to read the whole thing. They can get their Tragedy and Hope, and they can get Tragedy and Hope 101, and they can check the footnotes just to make sure that I'm not taking anything out of context, to make sure it actually says exactly what I've said it says, because the statements speak for themselves. When somebody starts telling you, when somebody, this Harvard-educated PhD who taught at Princeton and taught at the Foreign Services at Georgetown University, is telling you how the political system operates and how the experts are going to completely bypass the experts, is what he calls them. There's other words, the technocrats, the elite, the New World Order, whatever you want to call them. These are people who are unelected and do what they want to do, the policymakers. So when he says...
And he was also a teacher for Bill Clinton, right?
Sure, he was...
Bill Clinton's professor.
Sure, a Rhodes Scholar.
As a teenager, I heard John Kennedy's summons to citizenship. And then, as a student at Georgetown, I heard that call clarified by a professor named Carroll Quigley.
Which has got a whole other backstory in there. Cecil Rhodes, and this is one of the things that's covered in the book. But when somebody like that comes right out and tells you that at best the Democratic voter might have some choice between the people that are put forward, but that ultimately it won't make any difference to the elite because there won't be any real substantive policy difference between those that are put before them. Nothing that affects their agenda and how they've decided to govern. You read that and it puts things in perspective. And there are many other similar, like for instance, why do we have these central banks? Well, Carroll Quigley will tell you specifically why we have central banks. The central banks were created to control the governments, the nation-state governments. So it isn't because, oh, we need central banks because it's a fantastic thing or it's necessary for a modern economy or any of this other nonsense that they tell people. The central banks were created as a mechanism, as an instrument of control. He says that specifically. So there's no arguing over why the Federal Reserve exists. There's no arguing over why the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland, exists. They exist because they were created by the people that Quigley was allowed to research and look at their papers for 2 years. They were created by them to increase their power over the world.
And what's amazing about all this is, you know, the first time a person is exposed to a lot of this information, they want to believe that it's a bunch of, you know, crazy conspiracy theory type weird stuff. They don't want to accept it. But once you start looking into it, you have to accept it. And the reason is this is not just hidden secret information in somebody's basement somewhere, right? This is really, so much of this data is all out in the open and can be cross-referenced and double and triple checked. This is not hearsay. These are facts. And so the question is, do you want to learn the facts of your life and what controls your life and your environment? What controls your government? Do you want to know the truth, or do you not want to know the truth, right? So that's what it boils down to. And it's not a conspiracy theory, and you're not some kind of, you know, crazy, loony, tinfoil wearing hat guy, you know, like a lot of people like to say. And so, you know, to me, what amazes me is 90% of this information is all out in the open. And when you have somebody like Professor Quigley, who has taken the time, is a fine intellect, or was a fine intellect, and was able to get into the deeper bowels of the CFR and look at the archives without any hindrance for 2 years, then this is a golden opportunity to really see how things work. So,
and he wasn't against it either. So that's the other element. He wasn't antagonistic against these things. He was in general agreement with it.
That's why they let
him
in.
Even better.
Yeah.
You have somebody who's essentially an apologist for being created. So you even lose that that general argument against the veracity of statements based on quote unquote bias, which I don't usually buy that, because if you look at it, either it's true or it's not true. So people, I'll give you a perfect example. Bill Clinton, they said that the Monica Lewinsky scandal, one of the arguments in his defense was, these are people who just hate Bill Clinton and they're just trying to destroy him. They have a vendetta. And my argument against that was, it may or may not be true that the people who are out there speaking about this hate Bill Clinton and have a vendetta against him, but is there a blue dress or isn't there? It's irrelevant if the evidence supports what's being said. So I'm sure you're familiar with the infamous blue dress that supposedly had a stain on it and you know, matched his genetic code. That's where the argument goes. What is the evidence? Is this true? You're saying this is true. Can I verify it? If I can verify it, then the rest of the nonsense, you know, it's interesting you bring up the term conspiracy theory, because the conspiracy theory term was coined by the CIA itself. It was a pejorative coined by the CIA to shut down critical thinking. So you can verify that. You can listen to, I believe the ex-CIA agent's name is Steele. And you can look it up, and there's a clip. I actually posted it a while ago.
it was in response. I read an article some time ago about it. You know, is actually sourced documentation that the whole reason they come up with that was to prevent any kind of questioning of the JFK assassination. So that was a weaponized term that the CIA come up with, that they could stop all logical thought and argument. You just call somebody a conspiracy theorist, and all of a sudden the discussion's over.
And you can hear a CIA agent. So now we're making that claim, right? Let's say somebody's new and they're watching this and they're, okay, well, this guy's claiming, that the CIA did this. You can actually watch video of a CIA agent admitting that the CIA created that term for that specific purpose. So at that point, you don't have to listen to me. You don't have to listen to David Brown. Don't have to listen to anybody. You can just say, okay, well, this guy is a CIA agent, ex-CIA officer, and he's admitting it, that the agency did this, and then he will show the documents if you want to go look up the documents and actually look at it. So that's it isn't a lack of information that keeps people ignorant of this stuff. It's a lack of will to face it. So if people want to know what the truth is, it's absolutely available. It's easy enough to verify. It's just an issue of whether or not they want it.
Right, and we're all the beneficiaries of that. So really appreciate your excellent writing. So in wrapping up, where's the best place to stay up to date with what you're doing and your writing and all that sort of thing?
Well, if they just go to joeplummer.com, that's probably the easiest thing to remember, and they can find all the books there. And I periodically post stories, articles that I think are important and comment on them and stuff like that. But I would say that's probably the easiest. There's one URL, joeplummer.com. That's pretty easy to remember.
Right, and I'd like to say, that Joe's website is packed with important information, and so a lot of websites, if you go to their front page, it's basically that plus a little bit more. But I think, Joe's website is pretty in depth, and there's a lot of stuff there if you take the time to research it and look through it.
I've been working on that since 2004, 2005-ish. So yeah, there's a lot of stuff compiled over that period of time. It's been more than 10 years there.
So Joe, I'd like to thank you today for your time, and hopefully we can do this again in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Thank you.
Thanks.
Ladies and gentlemen, the very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. Even today, there is little value in opposing the threat of a closed society by imitating its arbitrary restrictions. Even today, there is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. That I do not intend to permit to the extent that it's in my control. And no official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence, on infiltration instead of invasion, on subversion instead of elections, on intimidation instead of free choice, on guerrillas by night instead of armies by day. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. I am not asking your newspapers to support an administration, but I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. I not only could not stifle controversy among your readers, I welcome it. This administration intends to be candid about its errors. For as a wise man once said, an error doesn't become a mistake until you refuse to correct it. We intend to accept full responsibility for our errors, and we expect you to point them out when we miss them. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. It means greater attention to improved understanding of the news, as well as improved transmission. And it means, finally, that government at all levels must meet its obligation to provide you with the fullest possible information outside the narrowest limits of national security. And so it is to the printing press, to the recorder of man's deeds, the keeper of his conscience, the courier of his news, that we look for strength and assistance, confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.